What we're going to try and explore is what is going on and what to do about it. So 2 easy questions to answer.
The crisis in the Eurozone is very similar to the crisis in the US and the UK in the sense that its origins comes from a dysfunctional financial system which lent too much, too cheaply and badly. What I don't think is the solution is to break up the euro. First of all, because it would lead to even more financial chaos, but secondly, because devaluation doesn't work. And we have a very good example of that, which is called Britain. What we do need is a change of policies. Now, we have one element in place, which is that finally the European Central Bank is willing to stabilise financial markets, and in particular government bond markets. We need to complement that with aggressive action to tackle the problems in the banking system. Above all, you, me, households, companies have too much debt, and as a result, we're not spending. Austerity is not a solution to that. We also need to tackle the elephant in the room, which is that Germany is spending much too little, saving too much, and running a huge current account surplus, which basically is imposing deflation on the rest of Europe. Now, we have a means to tackle that at the European level. We have a new system of rules. Unfortunately, it isn't being applied symmetrically to Germany, and it needs to be. And last but not least, and this is really crucial, we need to make the EU more democratic.
I don't agree with what Philippe was indicating, that the problem lies at the level of the financial sector and can be mainly resolved at that level. In fact, the current crisis in the Eurozone, as well as in Europe, has its roots in the performance of the overall economy and not in some specific part of it, like the banking system. Investment is at a very low ebb, and even the expenditure for R&D is below the critical mark of 3% of GNP that the European Union sees as a precondition for European prosperity.
We do need to understand the nature of our leaders, the quality of our leaders. Angela Merkel, she has found herself in the unfortunate position to also be leading several other 100 millions of people who share the currency, who did not elect her and don't necessarily like her. Crucially, she doesn't need them to like her, because all the people she does need to like her are her own voters. So the disconnect between the leadership of Germany, that is also the leadership of the Eurozone, is very important. She's doing the right thing by her voters and by her people. Is she doing the right thing by the Eurozone and everyone else who depends on her leadership? Not necessarily, because she sets the pace, and that pace is too slow.
Well, I agree with Matina that the underlying problem we have here is a political one, not necessarily an economic one, although it takes an economic form. The political resolution relies upon a decision to wind up the euro. I think it's much better to start from scratch again, to have a controlled dissolution of the Eurozone, and to then argue again as a European the reason for European integration. We have to be clear what the economic problem is. All these European countries, the weak and the strong, have got defective productive engines which are failing to generate the sort of values and growth and wealth which are the normal way that you have prosperity in a country. Instead, because those productive engines are dysfunctional effectively, are decayed, therefore you have the resort to an artificial way of maintaining the semblance of prosperity and rising living standards, namely living off the future, living off credit, living off debt. The Eurozone economies therefore all need, I would argue, to be renewed, to be restructured in some way. The Eurozone is a huge barrier. I think it provides a comfort blanket for the various national elites across Europe. It actually gives them a way out of actually even recognising, never mind addressing, that core problem of productive decay. The Eurozone will have to go in order for us to be able to get to the root of the economic problem.
The single biggest crisis in Europe, it is the crisis of leadership. And it began at the level of the euro with a distortion of risk incentives that attracted capital to flow to governments, for example, for government spending programs that were in some cases irresponsible, and to private sector projects that were irresponsible but that were able to access capital because it was so cheap, and where the competence did not exist to allocate that capital in a wise way. But what we then had was a reallocation of failed risk. The taxpayer was retrospectively put on the hook to pay for those losses. That is corporatism at its very worst. It is destroying the competition's ability to foster innovation, and it has completely distorted the playing field to the point where it's very difficult for SMEs across Europe to be able to access capital competitively. It suggests that governments are better at spending money and creating jobs than the private sector, which is nonsense. So we have this huge distortion. How do we fix this? First of all, I do not agree with the previous speaker that we must have an orderly dissolution of the euro. I don't think an orderly dissolution of the euro is possible. So we need to save it. First of all, we need an insolvency purge. We are going to have to bite the bullet and let a significant number of financial institutions, large ones, right across Europe, go into bankruptcy. We need a Hamiltonian debt federalisation. Alexander Hamilton did it shortly after the birth of the United States. And we need to create a vigorous European politics, and I think the shortcut to doing that is by merging the presidency of the Council and of the Commission, having an electoral college type situation set up across Europe so that the smaller member states still have a say, and having a contest of ideas, a battle of ideas on the European platform about what kind of Europe do we want for an elected president of Europe.
I agree with Declan that I don't think you can have an orderly dissolution of the euro. So if that is your way forward, then I think it's an unrealistic one. I also just disagree with the diagnosis. I mean, I've heard Phil talk about defective production engines before, but in the context of the United Kingdom, which is not part of the euro, and he thinks the same problem exists there. Actually, productive investment has been higher in the eurozone over the past decade, and indeed over the past 20 years than it has been in the UK.
I don't agree with Phil, but that's irrelevant. What I did find interesting in what he said was that you can't essentially retrospectively go into some kind of political union once you've already introduced a currency, which I assume is the basis for why he's saying, let's get rid of the currency.
It's very nice to think we could slowly, gradually democratise the European Union or the Eurozone. I think there's an underestimation of the undemocratic essence which is at the heart of Europe at the moment. People have never been engaged really within the European project, right from the 1950s. It's been an elite project which has actually functioned through the exclusion of people, through preventing people participate within it.
First of all, at the birth of the euro, there were majorities in favour of it in every single country, and there were obviously votes by elected national parliaments to bring it in. Secondly, even now, people are in favour of it. I mean, you'll be astonished, but you look in Greece, and you see 75% of Greeks want to stay in the euro.
These doors that are closed, let's blow the doors off. If you look at all of the alternative routes, I believe it is worth the risk of trying to democratise and bring the cold light of day into Europe.
I think
Matina.
you made a really good point, linking the dimensions of politics and leadership to the crisis. And you talked about Merkel having to justify her actions to, I quote, the German people. But because Germany has massively repressed real wages in the Agenda 2010, the only group that has really benefited from the euro is the German business class.
I think there's a slight irony between those who are calling for strong builder leadership in Europe, which I totally agree with, and those who dismiss strong leadership when it's been shown in the past as an elite project. Because that was in fact leadership being shown, bold, visionary leadership by the founders of Europe.
What's the difference between Phil's suggested orderly dissolution of the euro and Declan's, making banks go bankrupt and so on, which would presumably lead to the same, an unorderly dissolution of the euro through runs on banks and so on?
Surely the context this crisis is taking place in is that we are seeing a massive transfer of economic power from west to east. Europe is a declining economic star. Shouldn't we stop being such little Europeans and adopt a much more cosmopolitan, outward-looking mentality if we are going to provide for our European countries jobs and prosperity? We've been told about impending moves to democratise the European Union since its creation. If this was going to happen, it would have happened with the European Constitution. Clearly, it didn't happen.
Yeah, the bigger picture is that, yes, there's a big transformation of the world economy going on, which the debt crisis accelerated, which is the shift from west to east. We shouldn't be looking inwards, we should be looking outwards, both in Britain and in the Eurozone. We've been turning inwards and been thinking only about our own problems rather than looking also at the way the world's changing and the massive opportunities that it provides, and we need to be more cosmopolitan and outward looking. I think most people here are internationalists. And I think if you're saying that you're unhappy with the democratic nature of the EU project, then I think nearly everyone here agrees. But is the solution now to say, well, internationalism can only be undemocratic, and therefore we should go back purely to national solutions, which in effect is what is being said by some people here? Or do we say, actually, no, the world is going to be more internationalist. It's what we believe the way the world is going, the way the world ought to go, and we need to find ways of making it more democratic.
There's been no attempt over those 3 years of crisis to really engage people in resolving the problem. They have failed not because they're weak individuals necessarily, not because they've got national constituencies to kowtow to, but because of that essential dysfunctionality of the Eurozone, because of this mismatch between the politics and the monetary side of it. So they're trying to negotiate this. I say they're not stupid people, but they are stuck within this scenario of all they can do is renounce some initiative, fudging it together, and the only way you can get around that is a democratic engagement of people, and a focus for that, I'm arguing, is a focus to say not let's go back to little countries on their own. I very much agree with what was said in the middle back there. Actually, the European restructuring and renewal should be around a global economy, should be around its relationships to rising Asia. That would be a very positive message to take, but it must involve people in that because it's not an easy road to take.
Shouldn't we be more cosmopolitan? Sure. But we still need to be around. We're not going to give up on European growth because, whatever, the powerhouse of the global economy is moving to Asia.
The idea of removing sovereignty over budgets, removing the decisions that a country takes about how to spend its wealth and centralising that to the European level, that would mean that French bureaucrats or French officials or even MEPs could vote on decisions that affect Germany's budget, vice versa. I have never met a German, I have never met a Frenchman, I have never met a Greek or a Portuguese or even anybody Irish who would like that state of affairs to exist. One of the realities of life in Europe, something that Europeans have struggled for, one of the real gains of social democracy was the idea that national parliaments decided on fiscal questions so that would represent the desires of the peoples that lived there on how wealth was allocated. You cannot take that away. To impose it is the Troika. What is going on with the Troika in Southern Europe is what happens when you remove questions of fiscal matters from those societies. You end up with unrepresentative institutions.
People are terrified, for one thing, of losing the euro. That's the thing. They're terrified of being thrown to the wolves. I think that's how it is in Southern Europe. People are terrified of the future. They don't believe that there's a future that they can buy into or vote for. Nothing democratically is being put forward. So the only reason there is no enthusiasm for the Troika, no enthusiasm for the euro, no enthusiasm for the European project, the only thing which is there is a terror of being left to their own devices, because they don't also believe that their own political class are capable of putting forward a political alternative.
I think it's more likely that the euro collapses in an unmanaged way, in hyperinflation, and we have a very disorderly centrifugal releasing of forces. I think that's more likely, but I think it doesn't have to happen, and I think the best shot we have at catalysing something is by having that competition for that elected position.
Pushing the arguments that I'm saying for a controlled, it may not well be orderly, but a controlled wind-up of the euro is the way we'll also help get ourselves into a situation where we actually resolve those underlying economic problems.
There's a lot of democracy buzz around here, which is fantastic. We became nations and democracies through a very specific process of developing common narratives, a sense of common identity, of shared identity. Bruno was talking about Greek budgets controlled by French bureaucrats. Is there any chance that we can develop a primary identity of ourselves as being European? If there is, then we can have democracy, or we can do the two things together. And maybe it's a better way to go about things. But we're not there yet, I don't think.
The EU is democratic. The question is, it's not democratic enough. I mean, the fact is that the people who meet in the European Council are the elected leaders of every country, and decisions they take collectively are therefore democratic decisions. Now, I'm not saying that's sufficient. I'm saying to say that it's not democratic at all is just simply false. It is not democratic enough.